All right. So for this week's session, I do want to really pick up exactly where we left off last week. And so last week I concluded by raising the concern that America is coming apart in 2025, and that in particular the conduct of the immigrations and customs enforcement agents in the streets of American cities, especially Chicago, shows that they really consider themselves to be a hostile, occupying force that has to subdue, intimidate, express a kind of disdain and inferiority for the citizens that are in fact of the same country. And so we're familiar with this from colonial enterprises, right? That the colonizers very often try to express superiority to the colonized in the way in which they treat them, and to intimidate and in that way sow the seeds of fear, but also undermine the self-respect of those that they're dominating. And so I said something to you last week, which is that I thought maybe the American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq conducted themselves better vis-a-vis the people that they were occupying than the ICE troops in the streets of Chicago are conducting themselves with regards to the people of Chicago. And I have to admit I had reservations about that, and so I happened to see a colleague last week who studies Afghanistan and Iraq, and I asked her, what she thought of that statement, and I was really expecting she was going to push back, and obviously the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, the American troops were prone to abuse at points, right? They didn't always conduct themselves in the way that they were ordered to or required to, and in certain instances, it appears that a certain kind of license set in, and they degraded some of the people that they were supposed to be demonstrating a kind of regard for. We're not here to simply occupy and plunder. We're here to help you build a new and better society and polity. But the colleague didn't push back in the way that I thought she would. In fact, she said, I'm afraid there's nothing I can disagree with. And it makes me sad to say that, right? That the ICE troops in Chicago are behaving worse than the American military troops behaved in Baghdad, etc. And so this leads me to then really want to focus on this question. Are we in the process of social disintegration in the United States, coming apart as a society, such that one portion of America views another portion of America as enemies? And to be as clear as possible, I don't believe we're at the brink of civil war. And in the 21st century, unlike in the 19th century, I'm not sure civil war is a meaningful possibility in the United States, right? The pretext for the Civil War was in part that the militaries were organized by the states, and many of them were militias. And so the states could break away and take their militaries with them, and then there could be a war between the states. In the 21st century, of course, the states don't have militaries that they command of their own accord. The citizens don't have the kind of armaments that would allow them to have anything like a meaningful fight against the federal government. That in fact, what we see in the 21st century, even the late 20th century, when societies break apart or when governments are overthrown, that it tends to occur through peaceful civil resistance. And it seems to me what is much more likely to happen in the United States, if we can't right course, is the ongoing struggle that I described last week between repression and resistance. If the right people in the blue states and cities that are being occupied do not see the federal law enforcement enforcement agents. One moment. Um, don't see the federal law enforcement agents as doing something legitimate, legal, constitutional, just. Um, and if they feel sufficient solidarity with the people being targeted by them. And I think I mentioned this to you last week, 170 American citizens at least, right? That's as many as ProPublica could document, have been detained by ICE. And when I say detained, I was reading the story of one of them who was detained in Los Angeles or outside of Los Angeles. He was knocked down, thrown to the ground, handcuffed, thrown in the back of the car, taken to a detention center, and kept there for 3 days without being charged with anything, despite the fact that he was not only an American citizen but a Army veteran, because he had brown skin and because ICE didn't like the fact that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this has happened to many of our fellow citizens. And the idea, right, that is what repression looks like. Um, and that if we don't view it as law enforcement, if we don't view it as legal, if we don't view it as just or constitutional, many of us are going to be inclined to resist. And that means we're going to come out into the streets and we're going to blow our whistles and we're going to try to impede the ICE officers. And they're going to keep throwing tear gas and shooting pepper balls and spraying us with various chemical agents. And that this is going to be messy. This is going to be a difficult period in American history. I think is extremely distressing, right? And the idea. Let me say just a little bit more in terms of my motivation for talking with you about this today. That Joe Biden. So I'll go back to the previous president. Remember him, who I think in many ways saw himself as a unifier, or at least that's the role that he wanted to play. He thought that we had become deeply disunified by Donald Trump, that he was a polarizer, and that Joe Biden would come in and try to be president for all Americans, to return us to a model of civility and a model of political representation that didn't fracture so much as healed. And so I think that's what Joe Biden aimed to do. And I think in many ways his policies reflected that aim. The fact that the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act for the building of green energy infrastructure in the United States, that much of that money was directed to red states, to places that have been left out of wealth creation vis-a-vis the coastal states. In the post-industrial period in American economics, that these are states that are part of the union and that need the help of the federal government. And even though he's elected by the blue states, he's going to do things to benefit the red states. And I want to also say that though Joe Biden tried to do this, he was deeply out of step with his times. And in particular, I would view Biden's policies as classic kind of 1960s, 1970s, return of industrial policy to the United States. And we may very well need that. But we're not in that period anymore. We do not have 3 or 4 networks that hold the attention of most Americans and that are edited by journalists who see themselves as speaking for and to America as a whole. We're in a media environment where large technological corporations have made billions or trillions of dollars by funneling our attention and our communication into narrow sluices governed by algorithms that prey on base human emotions and that lead us to therefore hear only things that we agree with. And not only that, but pigeonhole us into little tribal compartments and lead us to feel a great deal of mistrust and hostility to the other side. And I know that most of us talking with each other today, I hope, don't spend a lot of time on social media. And so this may not describe um, our experience of the current media system, but I think we see at least an echo of it when we contrast MSNBC with Fox News and the clear disdain that the hosts, the commentators on each of those networks have for those they view from as coming from the other side. And so in that environment, right, and this sets up the problem. Joe Biden may be doing things that he views as potentially unifying the country, but they are refracted in a media environment, which is how most people get their information, into highly polarized takes on what he's doing. And so that half of America thinks that what Joe Biden is doing is simply a continuation of the priority of the coastal elites agenda. They're the ones who think that climate change is a problem, and that is explicitly hostile to the interest of many other Americans. And so the idea then that Joe Biden is succeeded by Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump is a politician and a man who has a much better understanding of the 21st century media environment because he spends an awful lot of time on social media, and that he not only has a strong understanding of it, he understands that in this environment, divisive politics strengthen his following. And so, as opposed to trying to unite in frankly, a kind of flat footed or 20th century way that doesn't work in the 21st century, Donald Trump is explicitly trying to divide us and explicitly trying to say to his base, I will be your vengeance. I will be the person who makes the people who've made you suffer suffer. And that is the base motive for the ICE occupations that are sweeping the United States, and I'm sure about to get worse. So having said that, right, Donald Trump is not just a product of a highly divided country. I don't think he originates this, but he is an accelerant of this. He is someone who understands his political strength as coming from division, and that he is benefited from further accelerating and deepening our divisions. And so I do want to ask, can this be stopped? And if so, how? And as you may hear, right now I'm emphasizing the media environment, and it does seem to me that much greater media regulation is necessary. I probably won't have much time for this today, but a topic for another day would be to dismantle the model of surveillance capitalism, to not let our media providers gather as much information about us as they do, to reassert some norms of privacy, and in so doing, to protect not only our data, our profile, our right behavioral integrity, if you will, but also to promote and protect civil discourse, to recognize that part of the root of the highly divisive and fractious media environment that we occupy in the 21st century is precisely the new forms of data mining and surveillance that make these companies all of this money. And if we could just change that regulatory environment, we might actually change our media system, without having to do things that run afoul of the First Amendment. Having said all of that, I'm not going to speak as much about that today because I want to provide some conceptual scaffolding for thinking about how societies are united and divided in the 21st century. And here I like the phrase from Benedict Anderson that we are an imagined community. And the idea that for, well, let us say, Homo sapiens sapiens have walked the planet for something approaching 300,000 years. That's my understanding of the current state of the science. And that for something around 295,000 of those 300,000 years, we have been highly tribal creatures. We've lived in small kin groups or tribal groups, and we have been uh, genuinely altruistic or pro-social with the members of our own group, and frankly, hostile to anyone who is not in our group. And for roughly the last 5,000 years, we have begun to build bigger civilizations. And so, as opposed to the community being structured by kin networks or direct relations of mutual knowledge and support, we have these imagined communities, these much larger societies. And it is a testament to, I think, the sociability, the expanded circles of sympathy of humankind that we can come together in a society of 100 or 300 million or even a billion people and manage to conceive ourselves as all part of the same group and all concerned for each other, integrated into the same society, feeling sufficient solidarity with each other to sacrifice some of our interests in order to promote the common good, in order to regulate our relations in a way that all members of our society can see as just. But that is what is falling apart. And my first question is, how did we do it? Can we look back and understand the sources of social solidarity in modern, complex, diverse, large societies? And so as we witness, right, this battle between repression and resistance and see the evidence that our society is coming apart, if we're interested in figuring out can we bring it back together again, then I think the first task is to figure out how we did this. I have on the board a few images, one of them from 1814, right? And this is the context of the War of 1812 when Britain invaded the United States and in revenge for the sacking of Ontario, burned Washington, D.C. And so we have here an image of the White House being burned. And fortunately, the elements cooperated with us. A big storm came into D.C. soon after the White House had been set ablaze, and it didn't actually burn to the ground. But nevertheless, this is a wood print that was widely circulated in newspapers and elsewhere in 1814. There was national concern, outrage that the British would attack the symbol of national unity. Let me be a little bit more specific. I'm going to call the White House one of the high churches of the American civil religion. And in saying that, I don't mean that that religion is a theological religion. As a matter of fact, our First Amendment gives us the right to freedom of religion and protects us from having to swear allegiance to any particular religion in order to hold public office. And so we are a religiously diverse society, and ever the more so now. right? A large portion of Americans no longer identify with any religion. Large numbers of Americans change their religion on a regular basis over the course of their lives, right? So not a traditionally religious society, but nevertheless a society that maybe until quite recently had certain ideas, documents, institutions, and symbols that we held to be sacred in something akin to a religious sense, right? The uh, opening lines of the Declaration of Independence or the preamble to the Constitution, right? Famously, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Almost all Americans are, in a sense, indoctrinated into that creed. And many of us, I think, still find that to be a very powerful expression. And part of the reason I think it has its power is because we know that everyone in our society has been taught this, and most people believe this. And in the same way, whether we're talking about the American flag or the Statue of Liberty or um, the White House or the Congress building, we view these, right, texts, documents, institutions, and symbols as things that we hallow collectively together, and that helps us to account for our commonality as a people. And of course, not to belabor the obvious, one portion of that symbolic pantheon is being torn down or was torn down last week. And I don't want to, be accused of pearl clutching. I don't think it's the most important. The East Wing of the White House is not something that is redolent with, I think, really important history. But the idea, on the one hand, and I want to talk about a few dimensions of this, that the President of the United States, by the way, perhaps the high priest of our civil religion, doesn't understand that this isn't his house to do with what he wants, that this is a house of the people that he is entrusted with during his time as president, and that he's just going to level any portion he wants, I think is extremely representative of the kind of president that he is. But deeper still, the idea that rather than announcing this in advance, by the way, this is, their laws and regulations that are supposed to govern when and how the White House can be altered. And obviously he didn't conform with those, but of the laws that he's broken, it seems to me this is the least significant. Again, it just represents or symbolizes nicely the lawlessness emanating from the house that he's now partially tearing down. But the idea that we didn't try in any way to commemorate or to think together about what transpired over the 80 odd years that was part of one of our high churches of civil religion, but didn't even get advance warning. Again, this reveals an attitude that I think doesn't in any way cherish our collective past. And the idea that no significance is attached to this, again, is representative of the idea that Donald Trump does not want to emphasize those aspects of shared history that might bring us together as a people despite our diversity, our differences, as opposed to that this is just his opportunity to put his imprint on this building. And again, the egoism, the narcissism, it says something about our historical moment that this is the kind of president that we have. And then the final dimension of this, and I think the deepest dimension, is that in many ways Donald Trump does want to tear these institutions down. And that for many Americans, the fact that people like me get a little bothered about the fact that this stuff is being done, or that it's being done without sufficient reverence for the institutions of the civil religion, speaks to, right, the idea that a substantial portion of the American population does not believe that this way of accounting for our commonality, our common identity, our shared convictions, our collective consciousness is um, the right way anymore. Right. And so at the deepest level, this seems to me to represent the fact that we're coming apart in a way that in 1814 we could all be unified around wanting to protect the symbol of our national belonging. In 2025, this no longer obtains. And so to get at this, what I want to do with you today is a little different from what we typically do, where we spend a fair bit of time talking about contemporary American politics. I'm going to try to push uh, back a little bit, to focus on some ideas that give us maybe some deeper conceptual resources with which to make sense of this idea that in the 20th century, in the 21st centuries, we are part of these much bigger communities that are much more diverse, much less traditional, and to ask how they are integrated, how they are unified. And to do that, I want to speak with you in particular about one of the founders of modern sociology, Emile Durkheim, a French man, a French Jew in particular, born in 1858, died in 1917. Not an especially long life, right? He didn't quite make it to 60 years old. I'll say this very quickly. He is the great theorist of solidarity, collective consciousness in modern, highly individualistic societies. And I'll just point out that his son, given who his father was, felt impelled to fight in World War I on behalf of France, and in fact died in the trenches in that war, and that Emile Durkheim was heartbroken, crestfallen, and probably died in 1917 in part because he was so diminished by the loss of his son that he couldn't resist the flu that was sweeping the world at that point. And so very quickly, right, Durkheim is Jewish in a moment in which there's a great deal of anti-Semitism sweeping France, and he, I think, is therefore particularly sensitive to the question of how solidarity, social solidarity, as he refers to it, this sense that we all belong together, can be tribal, right? And so even in a large society, if the French Christians pursue or consolidate their sense of belonging together in part by identifying the outgroup, the people they hate, the Jews, right? The enemy within, so to speak. Um, well, then this is not a just or a fair or an appropriate way to integrate a modern society. And so he's interested in discovering forms of social solidarity that don't involve reproducing tribalism at a larger scale. And Durkheim, in particular, then introduces some terms that I'm going to mention now and then we'll develop further: collective consciousness And I've already started to talk with you about the idea of a civic religion, the idea that there are certain beliefs that are shared beliefs in a society, and not just shared beliefs. Everybody knows that everybody in the society believes them, and that they can rely on them being upheld, taken for granted, and sufficiently strong to motivate conduct on the part of everyone in the society. And so I'll take an example from the United States, right, which is that we have profound, deep political differences, but we settle our differences through civil discourse, especially surrounding regularly held and freely contested elections, and we ultimately decide who wins these debates by casting votes, and that those votes are duly counted, registered, and determine the outcome of our elections. And the idea, right, then that this is not just something that's in our civics textbooks, but in our collective consciousness, that we take this for granted, that we maintain this, and that if anybody is trying to violate these norms, they're not just doing something that is illegal, they are injuring all of us, injuring our ability to take for granted these beliefs, and that therefore they have to be punished not only because they broke the law, but because they've injured us. And repairing our collective consciousness requires that they be deprived of their liberty in order to say, no, this is not something that we countenance. This is something that we take for granted, that you will adhere to these norms, these rules, these identities. And I said this to you last week, I'll say it to you again. When the President of the United States pardons or commutes the sentences of hundreds of people who invaded Congress in order to overturn the results of a duly conducted election, he doesn't just, right, show loyalty or deference to the people who support him, lopsided loyalty, I suppose it goes without saying, but he also shows that he does not believe that those norms are actually particularly important to him or his followers. He is undermining the collective consciousness of the United States. When collective consciousness is undermined, when as a result social integration and solidarity begin to weaken, Durkheim suggests we experience another state of affairs, a social state he refers to as anomie. And this is a technical term. Some of you, I imagine, have heard this before, some of you not. It refers to the absence of nomos, where that is a Greek term meaning both law and custom. The idea that there are certain norms, practices, ideas that all of us share and take for granted. As that begins to fall apart, we fall into anomie. And that the question that Durkheim was most interested to discover is how a modern, complex, individualistic society could resist anomie, could build up its social solidarity, integration, and collective consciousness. Having shown you those diagrams, which I've used before, right, just to kind of refresh your memory about the fact that we have had some conversations about Durkheimian categories before, I want to go much more into the detail of his thought. And so this is a diagram that I've created in order to try to consolidate the ideas that Durkheim set out in a series of long, involved, difficult books on these topics. By suggesting that for Durkheim, society, when it functions well, does or performs two key functional tasks. On the one hand, it engages in social integration. And that means it gives us all roles that we understand and that we can fashion for ourselves identities out of, performing in those roles the things that are expected of us, but also giving our little twist to them. And so roles here might include daughter, mother, right? Son, father, citizen, employee, uh, teacher, lawyer, etc. And so we have these roles, and these roles give us a kind of menu of identities that we can play that will be intelligible not only to the people in our immediate social circle, but to everybody in the world, right? And or at least in our social world. And so if I am a son and my parent is ill, and I ask my employer to take time off of work in order to be able to tend to my ill parent, they understand that is the role that a good son plays. And so we're beginning to get at the idea that these are not just roles that give us uh, structure to the way we conduct our lives and make us mutually intelligible to each other. They're normative roles. A son who doesn't try to take care of his parents when they're sick is not a good son, all things equal, right? And so that there are better or worse ways to play these roles, and that my employer should understand if, generally speaking, I'm a good employee. We could talk about what that means as well, but I, you know, do my duties at work. I'm productive. I am someone who generally chips in to the collective enterprise. Then they should also recognize that if they don't let me be a good son, I may find another job or be demoralized at work. So, right, society provides us roles. It provides us roles that regulate our conduct, that integrate us, that make us intelligible or understandable to each other. Society also regulates us through morality. It tells us what we can and can't do. Some of this may be simple etiquette. If you're walking in the building with a bunch of groceries in your hands and I'm walking in before you, I should hold the door for you, right? And in other societies that might not be the case, but around here that is part of what we expect of each other. But some of these, right, moral regulations may be much more to do with justice. I should not discriminate against you on the basis of your race or on the basis of your political beliefs or religion, right? And to the extent that I do, I'm failing to adhere to the norms of our society, what we all share in common. I'm violating the collective consciousness that integrates us into the same society. To turn to the details of the diagram for a second, I hope you can see that what I'm trying to represent is that these are continua from little to no social integration. And I don't think Durkheim thinks it's possible to have no social integration, but less demanding, less specific, less strong social integration to very strong, very specific, very demanding social integration, and the same thing, a spectrum with regards to moral regulation as well. And then what Durkheim suggests is we can be in different quadrants of this diagram, and different, right, circles represent different possibilities. I'm going to point out that in this quadrant, especially when we get to the outer rings, we have high levels of social integration and moral regulation. And Durkheim worries that that could be pathological, that could be such a dense or thick form of collective consciousness that it doesn't allow the individual sufficient freedom or autonomy to determine their own role or norm in society. And so individuals could end up feeling that this society just doesn't allow them the room to be the kind of person that they think they have to be. There's no authenticity or autonomy allowed in this society. And on the other hand, as we get into these quadrants where there's much less moral regulation and and integration, um, Durkheim worries that the collective consciousness or social solidarity becomes so thin that on the one hand, people don't know what's expected of them or what is the right role for them to play. And on the other hand, they don't trust each other. They don't understand each other. And that is reflected in the fact that then they are not sure that they can cooperate or work with each other. And I want to suggest using, right, that the idea that then there's a healthy level, right, in maybe indicated in this intermediary circle here, where there's not too much but not too little social integration and moral regulation. And that the United States and many other countries have been transitioning from being traditional to post traditional societies. And one way to think about this to begin with is, do you do what your parents did? If your parents are Protestant, are you the same kind of Protestant, the same denomination, right? And we know that this is not the case in the United States. That there's a tremendous religious churn, as Robert Putnam refers to it. We end up right. Very often marrying outside of our faith and changing to the faith of the person we marry, or else deciding that religion doesn't really work for me, and rather than replacing it with another religion, well, I'm going to shop in the smorgasbord of religions and take a little bit of this belief and a little bit of that belief. That makes us no longer traditional, but post-traditional. And the same thing with, for instance, gender roles. We no longer have tightly regulated gender roles, and we can be male or female or perhaps non-binary in a variety of different ways. But that it's not just we've become a post-traditional society, but maybe there are different kinds of post-traditional societies or different degrees of post-traditional society. And as we've, at least in the United States, in certain areas, have become more post-traditional, some people are experiencing this as a kind of social disintegration. We no longer know what is expected of us. Because I'm born male, is that expected of me that I'm going to live my life as a man, and that there are certain normative expectations around masculinity that I have to live up to? Or is it the case that that is no longer mandatory, that is no longer socially obligatory and taken for granted, right? And so Durkheim suggests if we move too quickly from more integration and regulation to less integration and regulation, many of us will experience this as a kind of social disintegration. And I do want to suggest that this is in fact happening in the United States. We've talked about this together before, right? The decline of religion and tradition, the growth of gender equality, the new gender roles, the idea that pronouns are now, for instance, something that you have agency over as opposed to merely being assigned to you, that your gender identity is elective as opposed to biological. This strikes some people as liberating and other people as, in fact, quite threatening. The idea that we've had a lot of migration, since we did migration reform in the 1960s, that we are becoming a genuinely multiracial society in which there won't be a racial majority pretty soon. And it's not just that there's great racial diversification, we have, through long, hard fought battles, moved in the direction of greater racial equality, especially for African Americans who were enslaved or subordinated for most of American history, and who are now asserting full equality under the law and in our society and rising to positions of high visibility. President, the Supreme Court, the vice president, the most admired, right, athletic or entertainment figures in our society. And similar things are happening with Latinos and Asians as well. And again, for some people, this is long overdue movement in the direction of justice and equality. And for other people, this is a threatening disruption of received social order. And so the final aspect of this I'm going to just mention very quickly is that we've suffered from rapid and dislocating economic change. And here I'm going to speak for just a moment about two events that I think are extremely important to recent epochs. One of them, the 2007-2008 economic crisis. And I know that the Great Recession may feel like a long time ago now, but I think we need to remember it's hard to get precise data on this, but it seems a conservative estimate is that 7 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure in the Great Recession, that roughly 50 million Americans fell into poverty in this period, that there was sustained downward economic mobility, therefore, for something like 1 in 7 Americans. And frankly, many people have never fully recovered from the economic damage that the Great Recession did to them. Add to that what precipitated the Great Recession was, right, bad practices by banks and bankers, right? The issuing of predatory loans, loans that the banks knew that the person being issued it would not be able to pay off unless they hit the lottery, right? And that the bank would ultimately take the home of the person, and that would be profitable for the bank but terrible for the individual. And by the way, it was almost certainly illegal, a violation of their regulations, and yet exactly one banker went to jail, while 7 million people at least lost their homes. But it's worse than that, right? We bailed out the banks, right? We gave billions of dollars of taxpayer money to the institutions that had generated our financial crisis and caused downward mobility. And when you take somebody's home, by the way, it's not just an economic damage, it is psychological, right? We invest great emotion in our homes. We have aspirations to raise children there. Maybe we have, in fact, raised children there, etc. It's where we build our intimate lives. And now it's been unceremoniously stripped from you. The institution that did it is not held accountable. The people who did it seem to skate away having made a bunch of money. And not only that, they don't even have to pay the cost of their own malfeasance. We, the taxpayers, bail them out, right? And so the beginning of the sense that, well, we have a system in this society, a system of laws, a system of democracy, political accountability. It is supposed to be just. It's supposed to work for all of us, but in fact, it's not. And that the system allowed certain Americans to do very well while showing complete indifference to the suffering of other Americans suggests, yes, we are coming apart, and that what enriches a group of Americans impoverishes another group of Americans, and the group getting rich doesn't care to step in, right? They could have passed laws that not only protected the banks, but also protected the homeowners against foreclosure. They could have done things to try to arrest the downward mobility of the people who were affected by the Great Recession. But no, they didn't. They turned a blind eye to the suffering of their fellow citizens. And now, when a president who seems to have a better understanding of that suffering and to be willing to give voice to the anger and grievance and resentment that is built up against those blue cities where the rich people who do so well in the new post-industrial economy live. Now that our guy is in the White House and making them suffer, they want to cry foul even though they did nothing to help us at the time. This is, I think, one source of the deep roots of our current discord in this country. I'll say this very quickly, that one of the things that tends to happen when a large portion of a society feels that social and cultural change are happening too quickly, that society is coming apart, that what used to be rules that worked for everyone now work for some but not for others, is they want somebody strong enough to make it stop, and even better, to reverse the clock, to go back to where we were before. And this tends to shift politics from one axis of competition between our major parties to another axis of competition. That the old axis, the axis that frankly I think people like Joe Biden still want to impose on American politics, is a axis of contestation between a more maximalist, taxation based, redistributive, and regulatory version of government. Call it liberalism, or the Democratic Party's vision through most of the second half of the 20th century. And the other side is, no, we don't want to tax as much. We don't want to regulate as much. We don't want to redistribute as much. Let the market do its magic. And if the government gets out of the way, right, everybody will be lifted by the economic engine of a flourishing capitalist economy. That's the old competition. The new competition is between authoritarian efforts to close the society, both directly against newly arriving people who are going to make it more diverse, and symbolically against the forces of rapid social and cultural change. And if that's one pole, the opposite pole is those who say, no, it's good for our economy, it's good for our society, it's good for our culture to welcome these newcomers and to welcome the change that is unfolding in our midst. And by the way, in this struggle, right, those who want to impose or reimpose tradition on society using the coercive power of the state, well, they have to repress those who are trying to create new lives in ways that are hostile to tradition. And so this tends to result in a different kind of political competition, a political competition that very frequently is between a populist and repressive, culturally conservative, anti-immigrant party, and a party that is much more open to immigration, to change, to liberalism and toleration. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm running out of time. I am not going to go into all of these details, that I wanted to go into with Durkheim for you, but I do think that an additional aspect of Durkheim's thought, which I know I've emphasized, but I want to say a little bit more about, is this idea that a well integrated society has shared collective consciousness, shared ideas and roles that everybody adheres to, and that we know that everybody adheres to. But I want to add that it's not just that a modern complex society struggles to have sufficient collective consciousness. It's that, in a sense, the collective consciousness of these societies takes a different form. It takes the form of rendering us all um, uh, useful to each other, dependent on each other, but also reliable to each other. We're not the same, but we complement each other. Our differences can be in part our strengths, but for that to be the case, right, the rules, the norms, the roles that allow us to perform complementary functions, to rely on each other despite our differences, have to be seen by everyone as to their good, as affirming their freedom, as fair to them, right? And when that is the case, people will adhere to the roles, subscribe to the norms, follow the rules and principles out of a sense of genuine obligation. This is good for me, and it makes me feel good to contribute to a form of collective accomplishment that makes us a good, just, fair, complex, but functional society. And if the perception, on the other hand, is that the rules of the game are stacked, are unfair, don't work for people like me, if the right liberal elite from the coastal cities is asking everybody to abide by these rules, but these rules in fact disadvantage a large portion of the population, then they're going to consider these rules to be impositions on them, foisted upon them by other people who are not like them. And so I hope it's clear what I'm driving at today, which is that if we take a sociological perspective that allows us to distance ourselves a little bit from the immediate distress of, right, politics in 2025, and instead take up a perspective that says, well, how do modern, complex, large societies come together? When do they fall apart? Part of what I hope we can see is we have been coming apart for a long time. We're now being further driven apart by relatively new social media platforms and by a president who thrives in a world of fracture and partisan polarization. But it's not all Donald Trump. This has been going on for a long time. And if we're going to address this, yes, we're going to have to figure out how to resist Donald Trump in the next 3 years. But after those 3 years, we're going to have to figure out, I think, frankly, better than Joe Biden did, how to bring the country back together again. Because if we can't do that, then we're going to just replay the repression and resistance drama, but this time with the other side on top, engaged in repression, and then other Americans resisting. And that is just going to keep getting worse until we figure out how to address this. Let me stop there. Want to hear your thoughts and comments. As always, who wants to start us out? Did this make sense? I hope this was a useful framework to begin thinking about this. Yeah, Barbara, go ahead.
At the very beginning and then again at the end, I am reminded of my trip to Washington, D.C. with my children when they were about 10 and 12. And we went on a tour of the White House and its Christmas decorations, going through the doorway that was just trashed. And Mr. Reagan's or the Reagan's decorations theme was nursery rhymes. And the very first one in the door was there was a crooked man who had a, I can't even say it out loud, um, who walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence upon a crooked stile. And it went on from there. Even my kids said, how can he call himself crooked? So that's my stake in the sand when I first realized maybe that we were on a weird path.
Interesting. And Barbara, I enjoy the vignette, and I'm also going to say I enjoy the background to your Zoom feed. And I just want to point out that yeah, it's the Statue of Liberty for those of you who can't see. Um, and one of the symbols of American civil religion, at least until quite recently. And of course, it's a symbol that refers to the fact that we are an immigration nation, right? Something that seems to be something that a substantial portion of the American population doesn't seem to want to continue or even to acknowledge in 2025. Thank you, Barbara. Anybody else with a vignette or a comment or something they want to query? Yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
I really appreciate this idea of collective consciousness. It makes a lot of sense to me. Um, what I do want to ask you is, can you redefine the word enemy?
Yeah, so in a sense, anomie is the absence of collective consciousness, but it's also the absence of social integration into roles that we can play or into norms that we all share. And so the idea that for us to really be a society, it's not enough that we all live in the same place and have the same ID cards and that the same rules be imposed on us. We have to also have a very strong sense that everyone who shares this identity also shares a certain range of beliefs, right? So that's the collective consciousness part. When that begins to break down, it's not just that we're no longer united by those beliefs, it's that we can no longer trust each other. We can no longer make sense of each other. We seem to grow distant from each other, almost unintelligible to each other, and certainly not accountable to each other via shared norms, right? And so yeah, there's this literature in sociology, which I think of as neo-Durkheimian, about how micro conduct constitutes the social, about how when you cut somebody off on the freeway, or when you don't hold the door open for them when they have their hands full with their groceries, in a sense, you're expressing something much deeper than that you're being an asshole at the moment, right? You're expressing the idea that you don't really consider them to be part of the same community with you. That when that starts to happen, then society starts to disintegrate in this technical sense that Durkheim refers to as anomie. Does that help to make better sense of it, Sandy?
Yes, that helps a lot. And also, it helps me understand when we no longer abide by separation of church and state. That hurts so much. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And I want to not lose the forest for the trees here. My central claim is this process of coming apart has been going on for quite a while now. And that I don't want to say that Barack Obama um, didn't care about the portion of America that was suffering in the Great Recession, but that the fact that he could get through Congress bills that bailed out the bank, but that he didn't really even try to get through Congress bills that bailed out the homeowners that were being foreclosed against by the banks, spoke to many people of a lopsided distribution of sympathy. He cares about the rich people who contributed to his campaign or who like having a biracial African American president, but he doesn't care about the little people who are the ones who actually were the backbone of America and now are being disavowed by the new America. All right, so I saw Hannah and then Anne. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, uh, just saying that yesterday I went to the doctor's, and the thing that really struck me, where you go in to uh, greet the person who's doing the scheduling and say that you're there, was a big sign that started aggressiveness will not. And I'm like, am I really living in a society that has that be how I'm greeted at a doctor's office? That's all.
Yeah, yeah, and the idea that I did say that some of this is just simple etiquette, right? That we're all in this together, and so I ride the buses and the subways in New York City on a regular basis, and we get more and more of those signs that it is illegal to, right? You will go to jail if you are aggressive with the person driving your bus. Do we really need to be told that? Right. But yes, I do think and I think it's in part that we are coming apart as a society, in part that we're no longer integrated into the same norms, and then it's in part what this new media system does to us, right? Where levels of disrespect that frankly, I think in an earlier generation or to people who are older just seem atrocious, um, are just the common coin of the realm in the social media world of the 21st century. So some of that is spilling over out of the right virtual world of social media and into the real world of everyday interaction. And go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One, you talked about the Great Recession and what it did, but it pushed me back to 1929, the Great Crash, which disrupted many more people. And the very rich that came out of that. And I'm wondering if some of them were tremendously generous and caring and gave wonderful things to all the people. I'm thinking of libraries and things like that. But if also that some of that sense of entitlement came out of that, of the things like the Trump family from that era.
Yeah, interesting. So I don't know enough of the history of the Trump family from that era to speak to that, but let me pivot from what you've just said, Anne, to a slightly different idea. And so you're probably following that over the last couple of days, the Trump administration has announced that it will not continue supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits to and I believe it's nearly 50 million Americans who receive nutrition assistance. We used to call it food stamps, right? It's a different program now, but it does the same thing. It helps families who are struggling to feed their children to feed their children, right? And I think this is an effort to generate leverage to make the Democrats cave on the struggle to reopen government. And I think it's an awful and probably illegal thing that the Trump administration is trying to do. I don't know if there will be sufficient pressure to cause them to back down because, right, of course, the Trump supporters, many of them are in fact the beneficiaries of this program, and this is going to create direct and extreme duress. When you don't know how you're going to feed your children, it's hard to concentrate on anything else. But having said that, let me also point out that while I can hope that the Trump administration will change course on this, I also am not sure that they will. And so that this might be an opportunity to do what Anne is indicating some people did in 1929 or during the Great Depression in 2025. And so to be concrete, that we should be looking for the food banks that are going to need our support. And I believe it's $8 billion a month that the federal government provides to SNAP, and it's going to be very hard for the well-motivated people in the United States to step in and replace that, let alone for the infrastructure to develop. But at least we can start to say, look, we're in this together. And then let me add, just as a thought, an idea. Yeah, I'm sure that there are food pantries in Oakland that could use your support. But there might also be food pantries in South Carolina or Mississippi that could use our support. And wouldn't it be interesting in 2025 for people in blue cities to say to people in red towns and districts across the South, yeah, we want to help you. And so we wish we could get government started again. We don't seem able to. Here's a donation. Here's something to try to alleviate some of your suffering. And that might take us a little bit back to the spirit of the Great Depression and to the idea that we're all in this together and that we need to pull together in times of stress and suffering. I see David's hand up. Go ahead, David.
A couple of thoughts. Apropos of what you just talked about. Maybe we could start an organization called the Blue Cross. But the the other thing is uh, the opportunistic way in which the Trump administration is using the shutdown to get rid of activities that it doesn't particularly want to support. And my field of education is a good example. Uh, Education has been even more decimated in the last month than it was earlier. They're just letting people go and they're letting functions just they just don't do them anymore.
Yeah.
This came home to me this morning because Barbara was feeling a little out of sorts and said, I better take a COVID test before I go, uh, interact with anyone and the like. I just feeling like a little head cold and things like that. So she said, would you uh, look this COVID test that we had in our apartment, would you look it up on the FDA site and see if it's still valid? I went to the FDA site and said, this is no longer operative. You
Yeah.
can't look up old COVID tests to see if they're still valid. Yeah, I don't know whether that's an intention that happened earlier where they just decided not to do that function within the FDA, or whether that was uh, caused by the government's disruption, the shutdown. But it's no
I
longer there.
I don't know if you remember, David, but 25 days ago, right when this was starting, 3 weeks ago, I gave a lecture to you about the shutdown and Doge, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, in combination. I showed a couple of different diagrams, which I don't have access to right now, but that arrayed governmental services on a left to right spectrum.
Right.
And this is just based on popular perceptions. Is this something that the
Right.
Democrats prefer, something that the Republicans prefer? And so Health and Human Services would be a classic left. Department of Defense would be a classic right. And that both the Doge firings and the shutdown of the government, to the extent that it was discretionary, tilted heavily against the left and for the right. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this is being weaponized. And please note that as I understand it, the SNAP statute creates an emergency fund for circumstances like this so that the benefits still go out even when the government is shut down, which has been past practice, but that the Trump administration is reinterpreting the statute to say, no, this is not the right kind of emergency, and therefore we're not going to distribute the benefits. I think I like Purple Cross better than Blue Cross, by the way. But yes, something along those lines might not be a bad idea. Barbara, did you raise your hand again? I can't tell.
Yes.
Okay.
Two thoughts. I don't know, maybe Purple Crescent, the cross is rather tilted to.
Yes, no, I had the thought too, but we need some
but that's
symbol,
not
right?
what I raised.
Go ahead.
When I think back on the foreclosures in 2007, 8, 9, and we say it's 7 million, I think of the math. In those houses were not single people by and large. They were families of at least two, probably at least three, four, maybe five if you count the children. Go fast forward 17 years. Most of those children are now adults, and many of them have children. So you get a multiplier going on here to get pretty darn close to that 50 million people on food stamps, because when people's homes were foreclosed on, they lost not only the roof.
Are you hearing me?